Hello, Professor Champy here once again. This time I want to talk to you a little bit about the idea of a thesis. So this is something that I'm sure we've heard a lot about throughout high school and everything else like that. The thesis statement, right? Everybody hates it. Nobody enjoys a thesis statement. So I want to try to give some advice now as we start working towards our first essay, this narrative essay, as we get in the very beginning stages of thinking how we're going to write this essay. One of the most important ideas is a thesis. So the first thing I would say about a thesis is that I really prefer to call it a thesis and not a thesis statement. The reason being that your thesis doesn't have to be just one sentence. I think that's one of the most annoying things that we were told about a thesis, that it's got to be just one sentence that encapsulates your whole paper, right? You go, okay, well that's really hard. My paper might be kind of complicated. It's hard to put into just one sentence. So that's the first thing. Don't worry about it just being one sentence. It could be two sentences, three sentences, as long as you need to explain it, really. The most important thing, though, is that you just want the audience to be able to say, that's the main idea. That's the main point of this essay. The thesis is your main idea. So again, not just one sentence necessarily, but you do have to have a main idea that the reader can point to and be like, okay, ultimately, here's what your essay is about. So that's really important, the first thing about thesis. So I'm thinking of this video as kind of going along with that little reading that I gave you, formulating a thesis. So I'm looking at that right now. And so what I was talking about is kind of that first bullet point, right? Where it says the thesis should be the most important point you make about your topic, right? Most important, main idea, all that. The other two things that it says here are kind of the maybe more complicated part of writing a thesis, but once we start to think about it this way, I think it's going to help a lot. I think it's going to make writing these papers a lot easier. So the other two bullet points at the top of that formulating a thesis page. The second one says the thesis should be more general than the ideas and facts used to support it. And the third one says the thesis should be focused enough to be covered in the space allotted for the essay. So this is kind of the toughest things about thesis, is having a thesis that's not too general and not too specific. It's got to be just right in the sweet spot there in between. Why? Because if your thesis is too general, if it's too wide, too broad, too all-encompassing, then it's going to be hard to make your point, like to make your argument really well in just 3 or 4 or 5 pages, the space for a college essay, right? One of the things about it when you're coming up with a thesis is that you have to be thinking about how long this paper needs to be. The thesis is going to be one of those things that makes it maybe the most important thing about whether you can write enough or if you don't have enough to write, or if you have too much to say. There can be a lot of problems. So you got to make sure that the thesis that you're able to kind of triangulate it and it's not too general, too specific. So if it's too general, to really make your argument, it might take 15 pages, and I don't think any of us want to write a 15-page paper at this time, or even a book for some topics. Like I remember for certain assignments I've done in the past, a student would write an essay about the environmental problems in our society need to be fixed, right? And if that's your thesis, if your thesis is just that environmental problems need to be fixed, well, now you have to talk about pollution. You have to talk about cars, gas, whatever, aerosol cans, all these things, right? Oil. You'd have to talk about all these different plastic in the ocean, all these different topics you'd have to cover. So if you were really going to do a good job with that kind of a thesis where it's got all these different topics, it's 20 pages, 25 pages, you could write a whole book about it. So you don't want your thesis to be too general because, while you might think that you're making your life easier because you're like, all right, I'll have a general thesis and then I can just say a whole bunch about it. What's going to end up happening is that you're going to have more to say, and in order to get it into the 4 pages or the 5 pages you have to write, you're going to end up having to take shortcuts and kind of half-ass it, right? So you would rather have you want to have a really well-argued paper, right? That's also long enough. So if you focus just on having a thesis where you're like, yeah, I can write a lot about this, you might end up boxing yourself into a corner where you either have to write 10 pages or you have to kind of do a bad job. So you don't want to end up in that situation. On the other side, if your thesis is too specific, you won't have enough to say. If it's if it doesn't give you enough room to kind of operate and to move around and give the rest of your paragraphs. So a lot of the times, if you feel you're having trouble with the length of your essay, I would always go back to the thesis and ask the question, is it too specific or is it too general? And is there any way you can kind of tweak it to make everything else fit? Because really having a thesis that is, something that you can argue and space that you have to do it, it's going to make your life a lot easier. It really is. Just to give another example from this, little essay. When they're talking about a thesis that's too general here, they say, they give the example of the thesis. I'm looking towards the end of the page. Malls have ruined the fabric of American life. So I think they use that example because you'd have to do a lot of things to prove that malls have ruined the fabric of American life. Because like they say in there, you'd have to talk about culture, economics, politics. You're talking about the fabric of American life. That's a lot to do. It's kind of like book topic. The other side, the other example they give here of a thesis that's too specific, at the bottom of the page, they say, the big city mall should not have been built because it reduced retail sales at existing big city stores by 21.4%. So I think you can see how that one's too specific, right? Because there's nothing left to argue. They kind of told you the whole thing already, so there's no really anything to add on to it. So you're not going to be able to write 3 or 4 pages. So not only, do we have to know that our thesis is the main idea of our essay, we also need to make sure that the main idea of the essay is appropriate for the length of the essay that we're writing. It's something that we can do a really good job of arguing in, 4 pages probably for our class. And then I would also just say that I like the questions that they have at the end here, where it says, will your thesis hold up to scrutiny? They say, does my thesis statement take a clear position? If so, what is that position? That's an important one. Do you have an argument? Is my thesis the most important point? Again, just that the thesis has to be the main idea, not a supporting idea. And is my thesis neither too general or too specific? Will I be able to argue it in the space and time allotted? And that's the question that I've really been emphasizing throughout this video. So I think if we think of a thesis this way, again, not as a thesis statement, not as just one sentence that says what you think, but as, just however many sentences it takes of you explaining the main idea that's then going to determine what you say in the rest of your paper and how long it is. And I think once we start realizing how important the thesis is in this way, writing out our essays is going to start to get a little bit easier. All right, thanks for listening. I'll talk to you again soon.